The bill the entire crypto industry has been waiting for just got delayed again. And the reason everyone is giving you is completely wrong. They are telling you it is about stablecoin yield. They are telling you it is about Coinbase versus the banks. They are telling you Senator Tom Tillis blinked. None of that is the real story. The real story is about who wins when nothing happens. And right now, that answer should make every XRP holder completely rethink this moment. Here is what actually happened this week. Over 120 crypto and blockchain organizations, including Coinbase, Kraken, the Blockchain Association, the Crypto Council for Innovation, sent a letter directly to the Senate Banking Committee on April 23rd. They were not celebrating, they were begging Senate Banking Committee Chairman Tim Scott to notice and schedule a markup of the Clarity Act. Because it has now been over 270 days since the House passed this bill with a 294 to 134 bipartisan vote. And the Senate Banking Committee has not held a single markup. Not one. Meanwhile, Kevin Warsh, Trump's nominee to replace Jerome Powell as Federal Reserve Chair, just sat in front of that same Senate Banking Committee and said on the record that a U.S. CBDC would be bad policy, that the Fed should not issue one, and if confirmed, he would not pursue it. Two things happened in the same week in front of the same committee, and they are telling you the same story. Stay with me. So here is the question I need you to sit with before we go deeper. If the Fed just slammed the door on a government-issued digital currency, and the White House has already said private companies will fill that infrastructure gap, then why is the one piece of legislation that legally enables those private companies still stuck in a committee? Who benefits from that gap staying open? And for how long? This is XRP News Flow Signals. We do not chase price action. We track the regulatory and institutional mechanics that determine where this asset class actually moves before it becomes obvious. No hype, no guessing, data and structure every single time. And what is happening in Washington right now is one of the most structurally significant moments in XRP's entire history. Not because a bill is delayed, because of what the delay reveals about who is positioned and who is not. Let me show you exactly what I mean. The surface coverage this week framed this as banks versus crypto. Two sides, normal Washington drama, nothing new. That framing is incomplete, and it is costing people clarity. What actually exists right now is a three-way fracture, and each side is using the Clarity Act as a weapon against the other two. First, the banking lobby, specifically not JP Morgan, not Bank of America. Those institutions have already made their internal decision about where the world is going. JP Morgan is building blockchain infrastructure. BlackRock has tokenization products moving. The pressure campaign against the Clarity Act is being run by smaller regional banks, community lenders in states like North Carolina, whose specific fear is not crypto as a concept, it is deposit flight. Here is how that math works. If a stablecoin issuer can offer 4%, 5%, 6% yield on a dollar-backed token, a retail depositor earning 0.4% at a local bank does the obvious thing. They move their money. When that happens at scale, community banks lose their funding base. They make fewer loans. Some of them fail. And in states where a senator's constituents bank locally, that is not lobbying noise. That is real political pressure with real electoral consequences. Second, Coinbase drew a hard line this week. After months of sitting at the negotiating table and signaling alignment, their legal leadership made a public statement. No stablecoin yield protection in the bill means no Coinbase support for the bill. That matters strategically, because without Coinbase, wavering senators have political cover to slow down. Even the industry can't agree is the single most effective line a hesitant senator can use when a banking association calls their office. Third, the White House, which spent months building a compromise designed to thread between those two positions, allows stablecoin rewards with guardrails, require disclosures, prevent misleading comparisons to FDIC-insured deposits. That compromise is currently getting torched from both sides simultaneously, and neither side wants to be blamed for it. That is the real structure of what broke this week. Not two sides fighting, three sides, all with legitimate grievances, all using the same bill as leverage. But there is a part of this story that most coverage is not touching, and it changes the read entirely. Because what I have not told you yet is what happened inside that same Senate Banking Committee this week, with a completely different nomination that reframes the entire Clarity Act fight. And once you see how those two things connect, the delay stops looking like a setback. It starts looking like something else. On April 22nd, Kevin Warsh sat in front of the Senate Banking Committee for his Federal Reserve confirmation hearing. And Senator Cynthia Lummis, who chairs the Senate Banking Subcommittee on Digital Assets, asked him two questions that matter more to XRP holders than anything else that happened in Washington this week. First, does the Fed have the legal right to issue a CBDC? Warsh's answer, on the record, under oath, a U.S. central bank digital currency would be a bad policy choice. He called digital assets already part of the fabric of our financial services industry and signaled they belong in the system going forward. He did not hedge. He did not say maybe. He aligned himself publicly with the position that the government should not build the digital payment infrastructure of the future. Second, and this is the one that matters most, if not the government, then who? The White House has already answered that question. When asked directly about digital infrastructure alternatives to a CBDC, the administration has pointed consistently to dollar-backed stablecoins, tokenized deposits, and private wholesale settlement networks. Private companies operating on compliant infrastructure inside the U.S. financial system now hold both of those statements at the same time. The Federal Reserve's incoming chair just said the government is not building digital payment rails, and the White House has said private companies will fill that gap. That is not speculation. That is the declared policy direction by the incoming leadership of the world's most powerful central bank. The question is, which private companies have the infrastructure, the institutional relationships, and the regulatory track record to actually deliver on that? And the answer to that question connects directly to why one company has been in those rooms more consistently than anyone else. Before I get into that, because the data on this is specific, and I want to give you the full picture, I need to tell you about something Brad Garlinghouse said at the Semaphore World Economy Summit 2 weeks ago, because it reframes the delay in a way that almost nobody is reporting correctly. Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse has revised his Clarity Act timeline 3 times in 2026. He started the year at the World Economic Forum in Davos, framing XRP not as a speculative asset, but as neutral financial infrastructure for a world increasingly fragmented by sanctions and geopolitical tension. At that point, he was giving the bill a 90% probability of passage by April. He then moved his projection to the end of May, his 3rd revision this year. But here is the statement that matters most, made at the Semaphore World Economy Summit on April 13th, roughly 10 days ago. When asked directly about the stablecoin yield impasse that has been blocking the Clarity Act, Garlinghouse said this: "When people are at their peak of frustration, that's when they finally compromise, and it gets done. I think we're there." That is a very specific read from someone who has been in those rooms. He is not saying the process is clean. He is saying the dysfunction itself is the signal that resolution is close. Garlinghouse also noted at Davos that stablecoin transaction volume grew from $19 trillion in 2024 to $33 trillion in 2025, roughly 75% year over year, and that institutional interest from firms like BlackRock and Vanguard had not yet been fully reflected in XRP's price. That was in January, when XRP was around $2.40. Meanwhile, DNY Mellon, one of the oldest and largest custodial banks in the United States, recently chose Ripple as a partner for its tokenized deposits capabilities. That is not a headline most retail holders are tracking. It should be. The pattern of access, of institutional partnership, of consistent positioning in Washington across the span of this administration is not coincidental. It maps precisely onto what the White House just said it needs: private companies building the blockchain infrastructure the U.S. financial system requires to modernize. Ripple has already built it. The Clarity Act is the legal framework that allows it to operate at scale inside the United States without ambiguity. And here is where the arithmetic of this moment becomes brutally important. Because if you think the Clarity Act is just about regulatory clarity for crypto companies, you are missing the structural prize that is sitting on the other side of this one committee vote. And when I show you the number, I want you to think about what it means for the timing you are navigating right now. The Federal Reserve's own data on U.S. wealth distribution shows a generational wealth transfer already underway. Baby boomer and silent generation wealth, accumulated over 4 decades in real estate, equities, and retirement accounts, is moving to millennials and Gen Z over the next 15 to 20 years. The scale of that transfer is estimated at $100 trillion. The CEO of Grayscale stated publicly that younger investors have a fundamentally different relationship with digital assets. They are not routing inheritance into bond funds. A material percentage is going into crypto. And the question of whether that happens on compliant, regulated, institutionally sound infrastructure or in a legal gray zone that gives regulators an excuse to intervene at the worst possible moment depends entirely on whether market structure legislation passes. That is the prize on the other side of the Clarity Act. Not retail speculation, not a price candle, a $100 trillion structural shift in where wealth is held and how it moves. Now here is the deadline math, and it is not flexible. Working backwards from the August congressional recess, if the Senate Banking Committee does not hold a markup in the next few weeks, the bill goes into September with midterm positioning math running in the background. The banking lobby, which is the single largest donor class in American political history, gets exponentially more powerful as election cycles activate. The political will to fight them on behalf of a crypto bill that retail holders care about and institutional donors oppose narrows to near zero. Senator Bernie Moreno said publicly this week that he expects market structure legislation to be completed by the end of May. He dismissed bank opposition to stablecoin rewards as a lot of noise in the system. That is the most direct public statement from a committee member in months. If he's right, the window is weeks. Not quarters, not years, weeks. And the institutions who are already positioned inside that window are not waiting for a price confirmation to tell them they were correct. If you have held XRP through the SEC lawsuit, through years where every other project operated freely and XRP was fighting for its legal existence, you already know what it costs to be right too early. You know the difference between understanding the structure and watching the structure unfold in slow motion while everyone else ignores it. This channel exists for exactly that person. If this is the level of analysis you want, not hype, not price calls, not hopium, but the actual regulatory mechanics, the real institutional positioning, the reads that matter before they become obvious, subscribe now. Not for this video, for what comes in the next 30 days as this deadline gets real. The window between when the structure becomes clear to institutions and when it becomes clear to retail is the most asymmetric moment in this asset class. You are standing in it. Here is what I want you to track heading into May. The first signal to watch is whether Senator Tim Scott announces a markup date for the Senate Banking Committee. Not a soon, not a we're making progress, a date. That is the only thing that matters as a near-term indicator of whether Garlinghouse's end-of-May timeline is realistic. The second signal is the Warsh confirmation path. Tillis is currently blocking the vote until the DOJ drops its investigation into Jerome Powell. If that resolves, and the White House has every incentive to make it resolve, Warsh gets confirmed. The incoming Fed chair's public position against a CBDC becomes institutional policy, and the private infrastructure conversation moves from White House talking points to formal Federal Reserve posture. That changes the urgency calculus for every institutional allocator on the sideline. The third signal, and this is the one I am watching most closely, is the full text of the Clarity Act as it enters markup. The bill, as currently structured, contains two provisions that have not been publicly debated: an ethics clause and a DeFi developer protection clause. Those clauses are still being negotiated. Depending on how they read, everything we discussed today about private infrastructure replacing CBDC rails, about stablecoin yield, about institutional allocation, could look different. The moment that text drops publicly, this channel will have the structural read before it lands in mainstream coverage. That is not a promise. That is the only reason this channel exists. Drop one word in the comments right now. May or June. Where do you think the Clarity Act markup actually happens? I read every single one, and it shapes what I cover next. This is XRP News Flow Signals. Data, not noise. Structure, not hype. See you in the next one.